Solid. All right, I'll give a little intro and then Kevin, we can start this party. So majority of y'all, I think, are from the Level Up invite I sent out yesterday. So just a little like kind of background. I'm a second year at UT Health. I started a journal club as a first year. We did it all like every Friday. We would eat lunch, and then since the situation started, it's been all online. So it's been great because we've had just like people, other students and other clinicians outside of our program to talk. And so I'm trying to like spread it as long as the quarantine COVID situation's going on, like might as well have more people join in on the combos. But the structure's really been each month we've had different topics. So we'll have 4 separate conversations every Saturday about the same topic. So this month's been like, it's been like a combination of clinical, like physical activity guidelines, resistance training, and strength conditioning. So this is the 3rd week. And then Taylor Eckel will present next week on kind of, I don't think she's going to present a paper, but she's going to present like kind of her model of how she looks like sets, reps, regression, progression, kind of big picture scheme for like a rehab PT setting. And then Kevin's going to talk about this DINK paper today. And normally it kind of depends on the paper and the guest who's speaking. But I think Kevin and I talked for today. I think the best call is because this paper is, it has pretty good like chunking. I think we'll just kind of go down the paper individually based on like 1, 2, 3, 4, the bolded points instead of trying to like hop around everywhere. So if y'all do like, if you want to have a question or talk about anything, just unmute yourself. You don't have to like do the chat or anything. I'd rather there be more of like a discussion instead of like a written, or if you feel more comfortable, you can obviously write it. But I think that's it. Kevin, do you want to give like a little background of what you're doing? And then maybe the potential new job if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Chris, for having me on. My name is Kevin McNamara, physical therapist. I graduated in 2019, so I've been out for a little over a year now. I went straight from grad school into a residency program. Currently finishing that up at Johns Hopkins in a sports medicine residency there. And Chris reached out to me here, and I think it's great what you guys got going on. I like this idea. It's very much sort of the similar kind of thought process that I had when I brought some of this information up to Quinn, co-founder of Clinical Athlete. And I think it's great that, just you get a group of people together. Let's talk about some stuff. Let's kind of see where everybody's coming from, kind of hone in on thought processes that are beneficial, maybe some ways that we can change our own thought process. And I think this is what the profession needs more of. There's a lot of complacency out there, and the fact that, you have whatever 8, 10 people on a call on a Saturday here to talk about, resistance training and physical therapy is great. So that's kind of the reason that I'm here, is hopefully I'll be able to provide a little bit of insight and contribute positively to the discussion. And yeah, that's all I got to say, man. Finishing up the residency here in August, and then I will be relocating to Seattle. I'm going to be taking in a part-time contract job with the Sounders out there. So that's kind of what's up next for me.
Dope. All right, sweet. So for the paper, do you want to give like a brief kind of rundown of why you chose this particular paper? And then maybe we just start at the intro.
Yeah, absolutely. So this paper, it's a review article, right? So, I mean, it's not something that has been, it's not a specific scientific study. It's kind of a collection of information that is put into a large conglomerate, and it goes very deep into one specific topic. And I really like this author group. Chris Bishop, Tim Sukamel, they've all done a ton of literature, and I think everything that they put out is really, really high quality. They've done a number of review articles in the past, and I think that they do a great job of starting very broad and then kind of narrowing it back in and giving you some real practical takeaways. So the reason I really wanted to choose this paper when Chris kind of presented this topic to me is, I think a lot of times we get a very kind of brief overview of resistance training, whether that's in PT school, whether it's in, undergraduate even as exercise physiology. You kind of don't get into some of the physiology or some of the reason why behind resistance training, you know, why this is a beneficial modality, why this is a beneficial intervention to put into a plan of care. So when I saw this paper, it really spoke to me because I think it does an excellent job of providing some real sound reasoning as to why we may want to make resistance training, or certainly why resistance training should be something of a physical therapy plan of care. And as we kind of run through this paper, they kind of touch on a number of different body systems, a number of different mechanisms. And then as we get into the tail end of it, they give you some real practical takeaways. And one of the things that I thought was really excellent about this paper was this avatar look at building a resistance training program based off of a certain condition that this person may have. So it takes into account all of these factors that we may see with someone when they come to physical therapy, right? So first of all, you know, general health, you know, what are they here for? What other comorbidities may they be dealing with? Specific to the musculoskeletal system, you know, why are they coming to me as a physical therapist? What are they dealing with? Are there various psychological factors that we need to take into account? Social and lifestyle factors, training variables, you know, is this person very new to training? Do they have an extensive training history? And then lastly is some of the genetic or the epigenetic factors that they touch on as well. And that kind of gives you a better understanding of, to one, you know, what's their response to resistance training maybe going to look like? Are there other variables at play that we need to be accounting for when we start to build that program? And kind of taking that avatar and building it into a structured resistance training, which they do, resistance training program, which they do throughout the paper, I thought was a great way to really tie in together all of these excellent systemic effects that we're seeing, and kind of giving you kind of like tying it up in a nice bow as to, okay, this is what this actually looks like in the real world. Here's some practical applications. And a lot of times I feel like that's what's missed when we have some of these nebulous or deep conversations about a specific topic or a theory. But I think that they do a great job in this paper in providing something that's practical to take away, that you can utilize and actually reference to build a plan of care.
That was so eloquent. That was great. Sweet. Yeah, I think that does give a good, like, kind of big picture viewpoint of this paper. And why I think it is beneficial for this month's topic, because it does kind of look at it from a 1,000-foot view of what are all these systemic effects that it's creating, and then looking at, you said, kind of all the factors you need to take into account with like the psychological, the age, the sex, the social factors, and then how that fits into the big picture. And then kind of at the end, as you said, where they put together, like, I think it was that postmenopausal woman, that training program, and how it looks like an actual legit training program for someone that age. And that's not really kind of the norm for being taught in PT school or in a lot of papers as well. You don't kind of see that level of that type of program being implemented in like a rehab setting.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's nice, right? Like, because, you know, everything's now is like, oh, you know, embrace uncertainty. And it's like, yes, I get that. But at the end of the day, we also want to have an understanding of, okay, like, I'm on board with these concepts. I'm on board with this topic. Like, how do I kind of build this into, or what does this actually look like in practice? So that's what I think that this author group in particular does a really good job of. They kind of take these complex topics, but they still provide something actionable to the reader. And like you mentioned with that training program to the, with the, you know, the menopausal woman, it's like, okay, like, obviously there's going to be individual differences, and it's going to be an N of one when you get down to the nitty gritty of building the program, but this is kind of what it looks like. And at the very least, it gives you some guardrails to know, okay, like, I got my head's in the right place, right? I'm doing a good job here. This is kind of what they're suggesting from the literature. It makes sense to me. Now I'll tweak it as I need to.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Do you want to start any like big picture thoughts you had with the intro section? And then if not, I have a few kind of talking points as well. You're muted.
And with the intro section, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me, a lot of this just kind of comes down to having an understanding of kind of dose response, and really getting into having the ability to recognize where certain deficits may be. Obviously, we talk about, you know, rate of force development is something that they mention early on. But again, I think, first of all, you have to have a certain base of absolute strength before you can really move into more of a dynamic, plyometric power sort of expression. So I think that's something that I really take away from the introduction. And that's something that I think is easily missed. I don't know that we spend enough time developing, relative or absolute strength. So I think that's something that was really important to me coming out of the introduction.
One of the points that I highlighted that I think would be a good discussion was, it was on, let's see, it was on the second page, about halfway down through the left column. It says, it must be pointed out that quote unquote strengthening programs and quote unquote strength training are not the same, hence they cannot be used interchangeably. And I want to hear your thoughts, kind of, where do you see the delineation? Because there is like, those aren't the same things, and it can be a very like ambiguous term of strength or strengthening. Like, what should be our working definition for strength training or strengthening programs? Like, do you see those as completely different, kind of like the author said?
I do, and I think it largely comes down to the population that you're dealing with. So when I'm thinking about strength training, like I'm thinking of training variables that my primary goal or my main objective or my key performance indicator that I'm utilizing is something where I'm expressing maximum force, right? So my prescription should look like something that is going to ultimately get me to that end goal. I think where things get lost, especially from a rehab standpoint, or even dealing with someone that is a novice trainer or has a low training history, is because of the quick neural adaptations, something that would maybe not classically fall under a strengthening prescription or a strength program where we're dealing with, intensities 75+%, it's relatively low rep ranges, longer rest periods, etc. They'll still see large gains in their force production, but it's not necessarily a result of the program. It's probably more some fine tuning from a motor sequencing standpoint. I think that's kind of where the delineation needs to be made is, yes, you may be seeing changes from an objective numbers perspective, despite maybe the flaws in the prescription, but I would not consider that actually a strengthening program. It may just be more of a result of someone of a low or a novice training age.
That was something that, so I just got done with my first clinical, and I was with a lot of people who, have never resistance trained, have never, they maybe have gone on walks or maybe ran 5Ks back in their prime, as they would say. But I guess something that I struggled with was, I'm trying to build up strength. I'm trying to build up resilience, whatever we want to say. But, I prescribe 3 sets of 15 at something, and then they do 45 reps in a row. And it's like, okay, hey, we're going to build up strength, but we got to do it at a perceived exertion of not -30, where you can do, after your set of 15, you can still do 30 more reps. So it's like, I don't know if we want to go down this rabbit hole, but how do you have that conversation with a patient who maybe doesn't have that history, have never lifted weights before, done any resistance training, and say, hey, it needs to be hard enough where you're not able to do all your sets in one set or all your reps in one set. You're not able to do, you need to be going till near failure, whatever, and then you also have the other aspect of like, hey, okay, yes, we're trying to get them stronger, but we're also maybe dealing with some pain, dealing with some irritation, and sometimes the intensity of exercise can be a trigger to how they respond, or how they're experiencing pain in the moment, and having some type of acute increase in pain. So I would love to hear from some people who have more experience than me, and how you have kind of played that tightrope.
I'll add to that, and the conversation with a CI potentially, who might kind of not be practicing that way.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's a hard balance to strike sometimes. So again, if we take somebody that's like brand new to resistance training, right? So they're also probably relatively new to some of the movements that we may be putting them through. So I think early on, maybe we just kind of scale back a little bit and be like, yes, like my ultimate goal is I want to develop as much force production with this person as possible. But before we get there, do we maybe need to kind of go to some motor learning 101 type stuff to where they start to feel comfortable? And so I think early on, you know, if they're able to bump out of, you know, on 3 sets of 15 with no issue, that's probably fine if we're kind of more establishing some motor learning type things. However, once we move beyond that, I think just really bringing it up, like you said, being like, look, I think this is kind of what we have going on. And from what I've seen just in my limited time practicing, the more sort of open and honest you can be with the person about what you think is kind of going on and what you think needs to happen to get them where they want to be to their end goal or their terminal task, I think people respond very well to that. So something where like, look, okay, you're having pain going up and down the stairs. The reason that I think this, you know, maybe I've done some dynamometry testing or something like that, is I see that there's a force production deficit going on here. So in order to sort of help get you to that terminal place where maybe you're not having that pain going up and down the stairs because for whatever reason the patellofemoral joint's irritated, we need to prescribe exercises and induce a plan of care that is going to increase your ability to produce force through that leg. So in order to do that, we have to engage in some form of training that is going to allow you to produce more force. And the only way to do that is to load you up heavy enough to the point where we're getting the adaptations that we want. So I think just being very upfront and honest with them and just say, you know, laying it out like, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I think we need to do to get you where you want to be, is probably the place that I would go for it there. Now with the pain discussion, that one's tough. So I think remaining fluid in your plan of care is really important. Having the ability to change things on the fly, because like you said, like, the human is a complex system, and somebody can come in on a Monday and they come in on a Wednesday and they're in a totally different place because we control, you know, if you're lucky, 60 minutes in that day, you know. So I think just being able to kind of shift and push some days, pull back other days, provided that you're still getting what you're kind of wanting out of it is important. So the pain discussion is very hard because without having the person in front of you, it's tough to say, you know, what changes I would make or what direction that I would go right there. But let's say that you have sort of 3 main things that you're trying to work on with the person. If the top one on that is force production or developing strength, they come in symptomatic or something like that. Okay, like what are goals 2 or goals 3 that I think that this person needs? Maybe I go to that on that day where they're not quite able or they're not in a position to execute in the manner that I had hoped if we're going after goal 1, if that makes sense. At least that's kind of the way that I've kind of approached that.
So one thing that I have generally been doing is we generally just tell them that when you're doing the exercise and if it's paining a little, that's fine, but there should be no remnant pain after you finish doing the exercise, like a max of say half an hour, but after that there should be no pain remaining after that. If it's staying, then there's something wrong, there's something that you've done wrong. So that is how we do the pain thing, how I've been doing it.
Yeah, I think that's great too. Like I've been using like lighting systems a lot lately, like red light, green light, yellow light. And I think if you can kind of lay it out to them, you know, green and yellow, we're fine, provided 24-hour later, you know, we're monitoring symptoms and things like that.
Yeah, so the pain should go away immediately after. And if you're having soreness, that soreness should stay for 24 hours and not more than that. If it's staying for longer, means you've pushed yourself too much and you should maybe scale down a little.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it for sure. The question about the CI, right? Sorry, I didn't want to miss your question, Andy. I think presenting something like this, having it where it's coming from a third party, or it's not directly from you, where you have something that is pretty objective that you can both kind of go through and reference, is a good way to go about that. I've found much more success with that as opposed to me just coming in, you know, challenging their ideas just, you know, with my own words or something like that. So I think if you can bring in some third-party literature, or even just say, you know, hey, I read this, you know, like, what do you think about it? It's probably the most productive way to go about having those conversations. It keeps things, you know, relatively stable. People don't feel like they're being attacked. It just allows you to kind of both look through something that is third party objective. I think that's a beneficial way to go about those conversations.
I think kind of going off that, like for one of my clinicals, one of my CIs that was there, one of the PTs, she's very modality heavy, and kind of having that conversation, like you said at the beginning, but also showing them, like I had a couple of her patients I took total basically control over and was loading them to a point she was like, I can't believe they're actually doing that. Like, no, they're actually able and they're capable of doing that. But to Mark's question is like every single time I'm having conversations with patients of like, you are capable of doing this. You are strong enough to do this. You can do this. Like I'm constantly like empowering them. Like you have the ability to go about this. Like we can do this together. I'm here. You'll be fine. It's properly loaded. Like you're okay. And just keep continually like that communication line open of like, how's everything going? I think you can still do more. How do you feel? What's your pain level? You know what I mean? Like red light, green light, yellow light, same kind of thing.
I think another strategy that can be really useful is like anchoring, especially like with the RPE scale or something like that. I think pretty much every patient should probably have an idea of how to gauge how challenging the exercise was for them, whether it's like, you know, that they're trying to get back to squatting, or if they're just trying to like gauge how hard their bout of like gardening was that day or something like that. So using the RPE scale and kind of if they're going to 45 reps on an exercise, saying, hey, like you're pretty strong. Like, let's see if we can bump the weight up a little bit, because I want you to be more in this range here. This is the range that we're going to see a little bit more of the adaptations that we're kind of shooting for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say don't be afraid to take your patients to failure, provided you're doing it in something that is, you know, constrained and safe enough. So I do that all the time. If you put them on a leg extension machine, or even something like sidelining external rotation, like they're not going to hurt themselves with that right there. But like you take them to failure and you're like, okay, this is a 10 out of 10. So when I say that we should be hitting, you know, 1 or 2 reps left in the tank, now at least they have something. They're like, oh, I've actually been there. Okay, now I have an understanding. So yeah, don't be afraid to take them to failure. Like I do that pretty regularly, you know, provided it's constrained, it's in a safe way. I think that's beneficial. So that was a good point.
Yeah, only other thing I'm gonna add to what you had said, Mark, is those people that you're just trying to build kind of like general work capacity, and they don't understand that like rest is like an okay thing, because some of these people come from backgrounds where, whether it's practice or military or just family like context, is that like rest is a bad thing. And so I found it helpful to just explain to patients that like, hey, when you rest, like you're refueling so that you can perform better on the next set. Or just like giving them like an EMOM type setup where they have to rest. And so it's like, okay, after you finish 10 reps, like you just chill out till the next minute rolls around. So it kind of fixes itself. So that's what I would say, just on a practical note too.
I think that's really good, because that's something that I struggle, or I guess the patients did. They just were like, well, if I'm not moving, I'm not doing anything. It's like, no, I use the kind of refuel example too. And then the other thing that just, I guess I've never had this in my life is like having to explain to someone what muscle soreness is, and them experiencing that for the first time. And that was just crazy to me, that they've never had muscle soreness before until they're 65 and going to physical therapy for the.
Yeah, that's a rude awakening, right? It's a fun one. Or the person that it's like, oh, it's painful. It's like, oh, is it painful? Or it's like, oh, like, well, I feel this working. Like, yeah, that's a conversation that never goes away.
All right. Let's go to the part 2, the strength, mechanotransduction, and neuroendocrine system. Kevin, what were your initial thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so I mean, I think obviously an understanding of, you know, how systems operate and what's kind of the underlying core principle when we're talking about resistance training is an important thing. So mechanical transduction is an interesting topic to me, just because I'll be honest, I don't have a great breadth or depth of understanding of it, but it seems to tie into a lot of things, and that really lays the groundwork for the rest of the paper, where that's actually the means by which we're seeing all these positive changes throughout these bodily systems. So I think, like anything, having a background from a physiology standpoint of what's kind of happening can only be beneficial. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go super deep into some of the basic science aspects, but at least having the knowledge of saying, so if somebody was to ask, say you cite something as to, well, we actually see, these positive changes with that. It's like, oh, what's responsible for that? Like, well, I don't know the exact details from the basic science standpoint, but it's a process called mechanical transduction, where essentially we're taking mechanical stimuli and the body is utilizing that to generate cellular responses for that. So I think just having a little bit of knowledge, or just enough to where you can kind of back up some of the things that you're saying, some of the positive adaptations, is beneficial just from a patient buy-in or a client buy-in perspective.
Kevin, to the part of that topic, or that this area, it talked about like the kind of delineation between morphological and neural factors. And you had kind of said that at the beginning, where a lot of times trying to delineate like strengthening what that is, a lot of times those initial weeks and months is a lot of these kind of neural changes and not a ton of kind of like actual hypertrophy or changes in the tissue. What are your thoughts on that from like a rehab standpoint? If you only have a patient for like 4 to 6 weeks, how would you kind of create that narrative? Because maybe a lot of PTs may be saying, oh, we're trying to increase like the size of your tissues or blah, blah, but it's such a short time frame, that may not even be possible.
Yeah, I would just be honest with them, that this kind of gets us back to like the strengthening versus strength program, and being like, well, I mean, a lot of what we're seeing is not necessarily directly related to actual tissue changes. It's more so from a motor control standpoint, you're just becoming more efficient. So I would just honestly just be very upfront and say that with them. And, if they have this idea that, we're strengthening, you're like, yeah, we're strengthening, but it's not in the way that you may think. I think most people probably don't really care enough. Like they see the numbers going up and they don't really care. But if somebody were to ask, I think just having this kind of in your back pocket, being like, yeah, you are, because there's actually a number of mechanisms that can be responsible for this. And given the current time frame that we're operating within, I think it's more likely that this is probably what's going on. You're still getting stronger, yes, but we're not seeing some of the tissue changes that maybe we would if we were to continue this long term, which, I hope you do, or something like that. So just kind of going about it in that way.
Does anyone have any questions or comments on this part of it? I think it was relatively straightforward. Dope. All right, moving on. So multi-systemic benefits. I think this one, there's a good amount more kind of meat to it and a lot more talking points. So what'd you think, Kevin? I
mean, it's pretty shocking, really, right? If you think about it, like kind of looking through at this, like everything that is going on here. I thought that this was great. So like, obviously it's stroking my bias a little bit because I'm going to be biased towards a resistance training side of stuff. But to me, it just really speaks to the power and the value of having at least some element of resistance training in your program, because a lot of this stuff we're not going to see from purely the aerobic side of stuff, even if we're talking about, getting into some of the bone health and whatnot right there. But even just starting, some of like the tumorigenic effects of exercise and dealing with everything from oncology rehabilitation, things like that. So to me, I think this is just an excellent one to kind of have tucked away. If anybody were to kind of question you onto like, well, why are you even doing this? And it's like, well, it's not simply a matter of I'm trying to improve their ability to produce force, but look at all the systemic health effects that we're getting from this. So I think it's just a great one to kind of reference regularly, and have as sort of ammunition to back up some of your prescription.
One of the quotes that I wanted to have a conversation about was one of the paragraphs that said, furthermore, there's strong evidence that exercise, including strength training, delivered within a biopsychosocial approach is effective for musculoskeletal pain. And I think there's a little bit more kind of I don't know if controversy, but discussion of like, is it someone getting stronger that's reducing like perceptions of pain, or is it like the act of resistance training? And that's kind of where I don't know, especially if you have some of these like higher end athletes who are already so strong, it's like, can you really honestly tell them that it's because they have weak XYZ, or is it like you have to use a different approach? Or even like general population, how can we say like getting them from a 50-pound like goblet squat to like 125-pound back squat? How can we like actually know that that's reducing their pain levels, or it's like that process and all these other like contextual factors?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely probably more the process. I think you would have a hard time kind of making the case that it's the same thing, right? We can't say that you have pain because you're weak. So we can't really say that, you don't have pain anymore because you're stronger. It's probably not the case. That's not to say that there may not be certain, elements at play with that, but I think it's too myopic to boil it down to, oh, you have less pain because you are stronger now. I think we would all agree that there's a lot more going on than would be the case there. So that kind of leads me to more as kind of the process of strength training, keeping in mind that, musculoskeletal rehab, we always have regression to the mean and natural history of conditions there. So we can never really be too sure that what we're doing is really having an impact on that. So I think if you keep things framed around function, usually what I try and say is, I'm just trying to make you, a little bit more robust, more resilient, to where you have sort of reserve capacity to go about your day-to-day things, to where we're not constantly operating at a 10 out of 10, right? If we're using the anchoring point, like if we're able to get you to a point where daily tasks are much less demanding than they were previously, I think that's just going to put you in a better position, not only from a pain perspective, but from a general health perspective. So that's kind of the way that I go about it. I try not to even allow them to make the connections in their head that, I'm getting stronger, therefore my pain is going away. I usually just kind of frame it around function.
The part with the cartilage not potentially thickening with resistance training, I don't know a ton about that, but I was curious to hear your thoughts with it, because it is interesting that it seems to be more of a genetic factor with increasing like cartilage thickness. Is that something that you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, or is that somewhat contradictory?
Yeah, I think it's more epigenetic, right? So it could be that like loading or strength training plays a role, but you might just have to be the right person with the cellular responses to have that. So I think that's what it kind of gets at from what I've read. It's not necessarily that strength training or weight bearing doesn't do anything. It's just that for subsets of the population, there may be more of an articular cartilage response to that. That's kind of what I got out of it. It's more of an epigenetic type thing. The articular cartilage one's really interesting, because I think one of the biggest changes for me, because if you think about just like a general population, like NEOA or something like that, if you can kind of frame NEOA, right? Because you'll have the people that come in and be like, yo, I got bone on bone in my knees. Like you hear that all the time. Like it's just something that's still out there. People come in saying that all the time. I think if you can actually touch on the physiology a little bit more, to where you are talking about, well, the interesting thing about NEOA is we actually know that it's not necessarily joint centric. It's a larger, systemic inflammatory process that's going on that actually makes some of these things more symptomatic. And one of the best ways that we can kind of combat systemic inflammation is actually, structured activity and physical exercise. So I think getting and shedding light on those kind of systemic inflammatory processes, if we're taking like an articular cartilage and NEOA perspective, is really helpful in getting buy-in. Because if they come in with the impression that their knee is bone on bone, and then you say, all right, we're going to load it, we're going to do some goblet squatting, like that's not going to make sense to them. So I think you have to kind of meet them halfway, or at least put a little bit of a nugget in their head being like, yes, there are changes that we see on imaging here. We see people that have similar changes that are not as symptomatic. And this is likely some of those systemic inflammatory processes at play here. So exercise is an excellent way to reduce inflammation and improve your health. And if we can do that, I think some of the sensations or the symptoms that you're feeling with regards to some of your knee may dissipate. So I think that's been a huge key for me. And I've actually had people respond pretty well, kind of changing the narrative and framing it from a different perspective in that sense.
Mind repeating the way that you phrased like how you convey that to patients, because I think that was like a really good and concise way of stating it. I've sort of like kind of played around with my jargon for the past year or so, like trying to figure out how can I like put it into simple terms, but also in a way that like the patient comes out of it feeling confident, stuff like that. You said it like really, really well. If you wouldn't mind repeating it real quick.
With regards to the knee OA? Yeah, so I mean, I would say like, you know, the funny thing about knee OA is like, yes, we see that there are changes on imaging. But the other piece to that is, you know, a lot of this we've now come to learn is largely a result of systemic inflammation. And one of the best ways that we can kind of go about decreasing that, which can play a role in your symptoms, is, you know, structured physical activity and exercise. So if we can get you moving a little bit, if we can improve your health through physical activity, I think we have a good shot of kind of decreasing some of the symptoms that you may have going on in your knee, because it's not necessarily a joint-centric condition. It's rather a kind of like a global systemic inflammatory process that we see now in some of the literature that may be a bigger driver of some of the symptoms that you're experiencing. I think it was different from the first time, but it was something around that like that.
You crushed it.
Good.
To that point, have you ever had patients that may be overweight or obese and they've been told by their other clinicians or healthcare providers that if they lose weight, then it's going to help with their OA, and then you may, as a PT, say we need to kind of have some like actual loading on these structures? Is that kind of contradictory in their heads of, well, I need to lose weight because there's too much load on these structures, but I need to load the structures?
Yeah, I think there's definitely that. So that one's usually one where, depending on how obese the person is, trying to find something that they can do, usually cardiovascular wise, and then limiting from like a weight bearing perspective. This is where something where like if you have like a leg press or something like that available to you is a good way to kind of still get what you're going after if they may be a little bit resistant to some more of the weight bearing activities. Because like, you know, as the clinician or, you know, as the coach, that I'm still basically getting what I want out of this, but they may not be just kind of privy to kind of what you're going on. So you're almost kind of pulling the wool over their eyes a little bit. I think that's a tough one though, man. Like the obese population is a very difficult one because they're usually like, you know, talking about systemic inflammation, you know, they're a lot of comorbidities. They've got a lot of stuff going on. They're usually in high amounts of pain. We already know that these are people that are likely, you know, in terms of behavior change, they're probably a ways away from starting physical activity. They're probably most likely coming to PT because they have pain, not necessarily because they want to start, you know, a lifestyle change involving exercise. So I don't have a great answer for them. I think it's a difficult population to deal with, but I would probably try and frame it in a similar way to where, you know, we don't necessarily have to do things that are purely weight bearing if that's you know, uncomfortable for you, or that seems to be a trigger of your symptoms. You know, where can we make some tweaks to programming or training to put you in positions where we're still able to kind of get what we're going after without putting you in the position that's uncomfortable for you, or maybe weight bearing, whatever averse they might have to that.
So you can, like, we can give them strength training without the resistance also, like start small, give them more basic exercises without the weights, and then once their pain goes away, they will be more compliant and will be ready to add weights slowly to the same exercise rather than just pushing them into resistance. That is more like, once they know that by doing this exercise my pain is going to go away, and then you just tell them that now your pain has gone away but you want it to stay away, so for that maintenance you need to add that little weight and have some change to reduce the muscle adaptation, because if you keep doing the same thing you're going to be adapted to it and your pain will come back, so you need to progress in some way.
What about then, like, Kevin, when you brought up the a lot of obese individuals, if they come in, they may come in primarily for pain. Do you feel like you always have to reshift their kind of thought process of how pain is kind of a very subjective and like floating target, and how you may need to focus on more of these kind of tasks or functional like aspects of their life, because pain is inherently never going to go away in a lot of parts of your life, and like tackling that is kind of a beast. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the it's a shitty conversation, man. Like it's uncomfortable every single time, and like I'm still butchering it, I'm sure, plenty. But I think you have to kind of approach it from that way, right? Because it to expect the provider, you know, to give you some magic exercise and take your pain away, we know that's not how this works, right? So at the very least, you need to be at least putting yourself in a position where you can be hopefully maximize your success as much as possible by kind of at least making them aware of like, look, there's a lot more going on here than simply, you know, some of the pain that you have going on. We know that there are biological, sociological, and psychological components to someone experiencing pain. So if you can kind of start to get them to recognize some of that, you know, usually starting off with stress or some simple analogy or something, correlation right there. If you can maybe start to make some correlations with regards to that, you know, I think that's probably a good way to go. But it's hard every single time, man. Like, it's a difficult conversation. I certainly don't have a good script for it yet. Some people are very open to it and like, oh yeah, you know, that makes sense. But what I've found is, you know, especially the people that are, you know, they're unhealthy, they're in chronic pain, like they're just really not that receptive to it. Like that's kind of like a broad stroke statement, but just kind of like what limited that I've seen right there. So I think it takes much longer, and you just got to kind of slowly chip away at it, maybe drop a little bit here, a little bit there. That's kind of the approach that I've taken. I can't say that it's been successful, but that's kind of the way that I've gone about it.
So I've actually been diving real deep into motivational interviewing the last like 2 months or so, because I think it's widely underused by clinicians in the, you know, the clinics, and it's something we're taught in school most places, and it's like we kind of see this like weird funky dialogue that seems very unnatural to kind of talk to a patient with. But I have been playing with trying to figure out how to help teach clinicians and students how to like best implement that in a kind of like an adapted way. And if you look into MI, they always talk about like the principle of, you know, the principles of motivational interviewing. And it's like, once you start to grasp that, I feel like if you can hear certain conversations that you're having with the patient, that they are expressing behavior change or change talk, if you have just like, it's literally, because I've been doing nutrition coaching since like 2016. So that's kind of how I got into MI. But if you can just like take a handful of nuggets from MI, you can start to have a conversation with that person. That's, I'm just like super stoked about it, because I feel like it can be a huge game changer for PTs, but then also, you know, the patients really make the changes on their own. Because I mean, a lot of people are afraid to talk about nutrition, but if you can get the patient to be like, oh yeah, I need to be eating more vegetables, and you're like, I didn't even tell them what to do. So I think it's a huge component that's missing from our field.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that's one thing at Hopkins. So they had required motivational interview training for every employee working in the medical side of stuff. And it's kind of like, it's the ORS acronym, right? It's like open-ended questions. I forget the other ones right there. I think it's a skill though. Like you have to be kind of like actively and like deliberately practicing it. And that's probably something that I definitely need to get better at. But yeah, motivational interview, that seems to be the most efficacious thing just in regards to behavior change. I think getting them to a point where like they're the one that's doing it, not because like you force them to do it. So I think, yeah, that's definitely a good resource and good tactic to kind of work on for sure.
Andy,
Go ahead.
Have you read the book Never Split the Difference? It's
No, it's I've heard about it, and it's on my never-ending to-do list of books to read.
Oh, okay. So it's basically like an FBI hostage negotiator. Now, I guess maybe when we're talking to patients, it's not that hostile of a situation, but I was using some of the things they were talking about. I had a lady who was been dealing with chronic Achilles tendonitis, whatever diagnosis. I don't remember what she came in with, but she was really frustrated about she's been dealing with this for 10 years, and I think we were like 5 weeks into therapy, and she wasn't really she was making progress, but in her head it was still hurting. And she, when she got here, she was like, I'm just frustrated because I feel like I haven't made any progress. And like one of the things that they talked about was just like literally just mirroring one to three of the last words they said. And I was just like, any progress? And just like paused and waited for her. And then she was like, well, I do feel stronger, and I guess my pain's not as frequent, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, I guess I am making a lot of progress. And then was like, her whole mood changed like that. And it was just like, I was like, whoa, okay, that's pretty sweet. And so I would be interested in learning more about all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. When you said hostage and negotiator, I actually had heard him on like Dax Shepard's podcast. And one of his principles was getting people to say no instead of yes when it comes to negotiations. And I actually, before the pandemic, I was like, oh, I'm going to try this. And I was on a flight, and I don't want to go on a super tangent, but I'm a huge storyteller. So if you stop me if I go too long, but essentially I was on this flight, and the idea of the principle of getting them to say no is you disarm them with like kindness, and like, you're like, oh, this is really going to like, you kind of like set the expectation that your request is going to be like outlandish and they're going to like halt their day, but really it's like a super like simple one. And essentially it's this idea that like, instead of people are more inclined to say no in negotiations than yes. So I ran with that principle, and on this flight, we were delayed by legit like 4 hours, and they were super kind. And I asked the flight attendant, I said, because we were delayed like 4 hours, I said, would it be too much trouble? Like, would it be a ridiculous request to have a free beer? And she said yes, because she's like, I'd have to give everyone a free beer, but she's like, here's a free $10 snack box. And the whole idea is like, no, to a normal person, to wait 4 hours for your flight, it wouldn't be ridiculous to get something free, right? Because you have been inconvenienced. So that's a good reminder, Mark. I'm going to wonder, think about how to implement that in the clinic, getting patients to say no instead of yes.
The guy you're talking about, Chris Voss, the FBI negotiator, if any of y'all have like masterclass, or if you know what that is, he's got a whole masterclass series on the art of negotiation. And like Mark, what you said, or maybe it was Andy, of like, it sounds intense because it's an FBI negotiator, but if you think about it, like PT and behavior change is pretty much just negotiating with the individual. And it's like, there's a give and a take, and it's how much where can you all meet in the middle of, okay, is this sustainable and can you adhere to this? And a lot of what y'all are talking about is in that masterclass series. It's phenomenal. But he goes and talks about like mirroring, labeling, all those things I think are great. Have any of y'all heard of street epistemology? Yeah, shaking heads, a few. So Michael Ray from Barbell Medicine talks about it a lot, but it's this guy from San Antonio, and he, I think he was a professor, but he goes to a college campus close to where he lives, and he just has a whiteboard, and he has students come up to him, and they ask like, what are you doing? And he just says, I have a hobby of talking to people about deeply rooted beliefs that they have. And I forget how he phrases it, but he's like, I just want to hear more. I want to question you about how you came to the conclusion of your belief. And so it goes into more like intense concepts like religion and politics, but he does a great job. Like if you ever just watch his interviews, like YouTube street epistemology, and he'll pop up, and it's like these 40-minute conversations, and he says he's going to cap the combo at 5 minutes, but it's his formatting of how he goes about being extremely like warm and open, but like questioning people to explain how they've come to the conclusion. So it's a great kind of like thought experiment for doing that in a rehab setting of it, similar to these like motivational interviewing concepts or like the Chris Voss thing. It's really like you're not telling them what to do, and you're literally just like presenting them with what they said, or maybe kind of rephrasing it and then having them listen to their own thoughts and realize, okay, does that, like, do I need to expand on that, or do I need to, like, did that even make sense to me? And they're like digesting their own kind of experience of what they're saying. And it's phenomenal to see, like, over this period of time, them really like reconceptualize what they held their strongly like held beliefs and how they're kind of pulling back with more uncertainty. And that may be like a good thing to try with like patients who are who have deeply held beliefs about like why they need manual therapy or why they need cupping. And you kind of like can go down this like thought experiment process with them of like asking them why they believe it works for them. And then like it goes down this path. But yeah, I think street epistemology, if you have like extra time to just watch this guy, I think it's phenomenal.
And I think it kind of goes back to, I mean, your question about the pain thing was I had a cervical fusion radiculopathy patient in clinic this summer, and he was always in pain, always in pain, always in pain. And we finally got him moving like 2 weeks in, and he was, you know, he's a pretty big, strong dude. Comes in, start loading him nice and heavy, and he's feeling a lot better. He comes in one Monday, all of a sudden he's like, I can't do anything. I'm in so much pain. And just kind of like diving in, like, hey, like, what'd you do this weekend? You know, like, did you do anything out of the norm? Were you sleeping? We'll come to find out it was like his stepfather passed away. And all of a sudden it was like, well, you know, we're doing the same thing we did last week. You did the same thing you did the weekend before. It was just something else, you know, psychologically, sociologically, like that came into play. And there's a lot of, you know, trying to show that to patients. And with that motivational interviewing is like leading them down that path of like, hey, there's a lot more that comes into this pain idea than just your actual muscles and exercises and things like that. So I feel like that's a good, like, circle back around, I guess, to that.
Yeah, not to get off like that tangent, because I could like talk about it a lot, but and I'm not trying to like self-promote, but I'll be dropping a lot of content on videos between nutrition clients where I'll be using motivational interviewing to kind of like see it in action, because you can definitely get it in a lot less time than people realize.
Dope. Okay, the next part that I thought was interesting in this section where it talks about walking is like not enough of a stimulus. And a lot of times, I mean, considering motivational interviewing, like a lot of these first steps are like, okay, let's try to get you walking the mailbox, or let's see you get to walk. But inherently, like from behavior change standpoint, yeah, you're making them do more, but that's still really not like, that's just a small drop in the bucket from an actual like adaptation standpoint. I'm curious if any of y'all have any other thoughts about it, of just like some of these walking or some of these low load things. It's really not enough a stimulus for like bone change or like bigger adaptations.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, so like, let's take a walking program, for example, right? It's low-hanging fruit that is good for someone that is going from doing absolutely nothing, you know, they're like 800 steps a day or something like that, to that's something what I would go to, where it's like, okay, at the very least, if I can get you walking, now we at least can get the ball rolling, doing something right there. So it's kind of like a bargaining chip to like, all right, at the very least, I know that if I give them a walking program, it's going to be doing something. So I think I think the problem comes in is where we think like that is, you know, sort of like the panacea of, you know, chronic pain or musculoskeletal stuff. It's like, oh, well, like, get them on a walking program. It's like, yeah, maybe, but it's like, it comes down to like, well, what are we really trying to get with that, right? Is it just a matter of just trying to engage in some sort of physical activity in general, or are we like sort of purporting that it's really having these dramatic systemic effects? I thought it was interesting too, because it does, for some reason, walking just gets like this, it's like it's pure gold, you know? It's like, and it's like, oh, is it really? Like, it's something, but is it really what we want? Is that what we're like the end goal is?
What if they walk down a really steep hill? Do you think that's enough of like an eccentric stress? or is it too much of a risk for them to actually fall down the hill?
It depends on the person, man. Like I remember I had a dude that was in like, he was like chronic pain forever. I put him in like quadruped and he came back on Wednesday or something like that. And he's like totally debilitated, like just from like the stretch on his quads, just because like he was like so deconditioned through that right there. So it's being like a year out, like it's shocking to me how little of a stimulus some people are able to tolerate.
But even then, I kind of like it as just like you mentioned, it's just a way to get the ball rolling. And I feel like one of the biggest barriers to like physical activity in general is just starting. And like I think about it even with me, it's a lot easier to get me to like say do more when I'm already like mid workout versus trying to get me to get off the couch and do said thing. So yeah, like low hanging fruit, better than nothing. But also while they're doing it, it's now easy to kind of transfer into, hey, we're doing this. You want to try this instead now?
And it is just like big rocks with, if they're doing, as you said, Kevin, like 800 steps a day, they should probably be doing more than that. And that goes to like the initial week of this month with Derek Miles, when he talks about just physical activity guidelines, and the majority of the population is so drastically under that. Then it's maybe like, okay, let's get them in the habit of meeting basic guidelines of like aerobic and strength training. But to do that, like there's a big kind of leap between 2 times a week of resistance training and like 150 minutes of moderate aerobic work compared to like potentially doing nothing. So it is like, how do you bridge that gap? Kevin, do you want?
100%. Yeah, I think it's kind of understanding where the person is at, right? And I've been guilty of this before. I think even just from like even going back to like personal training clients and things like that, you can't kind of like impose like your biases and your beliefs like onto the person. I think that's something that I've gotten better at doing, but kind of like understanding, like just because I think like, this is what you really need, it's like I can't kind of enforce that onto you, right? So like there has to be something where you kind of meet them where they are and just kind of nudge them forward. And is it optimal like to say that all this person is doing is just walking? No, but if they were doing nothing and now they're hitting 7,000 steps a day or something like that, I think that's a win. And sometimes you just kind of have to take that and play the long game a little bit.
I think on the other hand, something that, I have been thinking about a lot with, the past couple of weeks being in the clinic was like how just in general detrained a lot of the people we see are. And also when you like look at you think about it on the spectrum of like, okay, how sensitive they are to training, how sensitive they are to adaptation. Like we've got people who are super detrained, who are, potentially in some chronic pain, potentially in having some issues that they're coming to see a physical therapist or in a rehab setting. And, a lot of the people that we see are probably not on the spectrum of a 17-year-old high school football player that can eat popcorn and squat once a week and all of a sudden are squatting 500 pounds. I think that a lot of them are very takes a lot of stress to cause an adaptation compared to maybe some people that we would see in like a personal training setting. So I was having a lot of conversations with my CI of like, okay, we probably can continue to make some type of progress every time they come in, with the goal of kind of building that base higher, because for them to continue to make adaptations, they're going to need to maybe do a decent amount of volume, as long as, we're not doing something that is continually irritating their symptoms and causing their, outside life, the other 23 hours in their day, just to be hell and not able to do their day-to-day life. Like in my head at least, and I'm open to hearing your guys' thoughts, is like I'm trying to get them to do as much as, to closest to as much as they're able to handle at that moment, so that we can just continue to build that, their cup builder, whatever, or bigger, whatever metaphor or analogy you want to use.
I think that I try to load people almost in a secret way. I guess, and weirdly, like my CI would always be like, "What are you doing? Like, why are you having them do carries like while they're walking?" You know, it's like their lower extremity. It's like just simple little things like that, like stair stepping. Like if I'm gonna have them do something like that, well, why not carry a weight around? Like let's load them to a point like they have to do things like that in real life anyway. So you have to carry groceries at some point. You're gonna pick up something. Like why not do unilateral, you know, carries or whatever, farmers carries down the hallway or anything to that extent of like, yes, it's aerobic, I guess, side of it even more too. So that's what I try to do that more than anything, is try and sneak little things in there that the patient knows they're capable of doing it, and they know there's a transfer right across to something else in real life. So that's what I usually try to do.
Yeah, I like the idea of that. And then every once in a while, kind of calling them out on it. And it's like, hey, look at what you just did. I know Chris has an example from Chris. I forgot the PT that has it with
Eric Mira.
kind of like a deadlift, like dynamometries, almost like setup.
Yeah, the crane scale.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess to build off that, it's just Eric Mira talks a lot about like kind of what Alec mentioned with anchoring. It's like if you have a patient come in and you have this almost like, it's like a mid-thigh pull, but it's lower to the ground and it's just a crane scale. It's like you consistently show them that they can produce more force than they thought. And it's like, it's low barrier to entry. They just like put as much effort into it as they want. And I don't know where I was going at this point. Why'd you bring that up, Gabe?
I was bringing it up kind of more to show, like, kind of instill confidence.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like a lot of their patients think they can do very little until you kind of sometimes maybe even trick them into doing something. And I liked that example because it's like the patient isn't necessarily seeing like a bunch of weight on something. They're just putting force through it. And each time, if I'm understanding it right, you can see that, hey, they're generating more force now, like they're somewhat improving, but it's not this daunting task to them that they're going to shy away from.
Yeah, and it's definitely, I mean, it's like, it's in their best interest. You're not like tricking them to be mean or anything like that. Like I get, so what I was saying for those who hadn't heard before, essentially what I like to do at my clinic, we have a crane scale that we can use that has a handle on it. And like, for instance, I had this patient that we were consistently lifting like the 25-pound kettlebell, and I knew she was capable of more, but every time we would get done, I'd ask her how hard that was, and she was like, it was pretty hard. And so one day I got out the crane scale and she pulled into it. I was just like, just pull into this as hard as you can. And she pulled into it and pulled like 100 pounds. And so I was like, see how strong you are. Like, we need to be lifting a little bit more weight, and you can do it. It's just, you know, kind of building that confidence with that sort of thing, and showing them that like it is okay to try challenging things and that you're not going to hurt yourself, but can actually be really beneficial. I like highly recommend getting a crane for a lot of things. I like try to use it for everything I can at the clinic because it's like super objective and a really good way of demonstrating to patients like a multitude of stuff.
I would agree. I think having data in regards to like force production is of paramount importance. I mean, it's handheld dynamometry, anything like that, because you can also track over time too. And if we're actually dealing, like moving beyond, like, let's say we're moving into more of a, you know, an athletic population where we have to have some sort of objective measure to guide programming. It's invaluable to me to have some sort of objective measure, for one, not only because like you can show the person, you know, if there's any sort of fear avoidance or anything going on, you're actually capable of much more than you think, but also too, from just a programming standpoint, it's I would say like it's range of motion and dynamometry or force production, like one of the few things like in PT that is actually like objective that we can consistently track and monitor over time. I guess you could do like swelling or something like that if you're taking girth measurements, but I think it's vital to have something like that.
that was kind of like the conversation I had with you, Kevin, on the phone a week or two ago about like, I was going down this like San Diego Pain Summit rabbit hole for the past like 2 months. And they all kind of, I mean, it's an echo chamber of like, they're all promoting biopsychosocial model and pain science, which isn't bad, but there's inherently like so much, and they explain it like so much complexity and subjectivity to pain that it's like, how do you even accomplish this kind of goal with a lot of things they're talking about in a rehab setting, where when you think about it, like what you said, Kevin, the more objective kind of measures you have, the easier it is to track, to move in some direction. Because what all those summits we're talking about is like, there is complexity of pain, and maybe it's not like tissue dependent or there's so many factors, but it is like in an everyday PT setting, what do we focus on and how do we have things? And like, obviously you can't talk your patient out of pain, and you may not be able to like train them out of pain, but at least like they're moving towards, like, there's so many other positive factors of resistance training, like we're talking about in this paper, of like, maybe even if they don't get out of pain, they probably still have like more fitness adaptations and better like potentially quality of life if they persist down this path, and they can maybe manage their pain. But it is like, it's a different goal with these objective measures. And you can actually like, you can see something at the, like, you have monthly or yearly long goals, whereas pain, it's like, okay, next year I want to be like a 3 out of 10 on pain. It's like, what does that even mean to you? Like, how do you track that? So I think it's just easier and makes more sense to have more and more like reliable and objective ways to track physical therapy.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I try to objectify everything that I can. The funny thing is, with talking about like persistent pain populations, I forget what I was going to say with that. I know what it was. I think that's something that I've found is you have to really dig and try to get some sort of functional goal out of people. Otherwise, it's a complete shit show, because if their whole purpose of coming into PT is strictly centered on decreasing their pain, you have to have the conversation with them. It's like, well, we'll see what we can do about that. But there's a good chance that because of, talking about all the complexity, kind of layering in that education to it, like we have to have something. That's what I've found, is to be as successful as you can be, you have to try and get something functional out of them. Because otherwise, you're just kind of going about it, and the pain's really not going to change, even no matter what you do, for the most part, depending on what we're dealing with there, especially if it's something chronic like that. So maybe kind of taking it objectively that way, really trying to get specific into some of their functional goals, or, like, why do they want to be without pain? What's stopping them? What are some things in their life that they currently feel like they're unable to do or pursue, is a way to go about it. So I think getting something functional out of the person is huge, just in terms of setting up a successful plan of care.
Chris, would you say that you could run a novice linear pain regression? Just start at 5 and then next week go to 4? No, okay.
Essentially, I mean, natural history is probably best at doing that. So I would just let them solve that themselves. So I'd say like maybe the last thing we can have a big conversation about is the what we mentioned earlier, that table of the table 3 of the example of the female with postmenopausal woman, and kind of the structure of, they had like a 3-phase training program, and maybe y'all's thoughts about it, or how it is kind of like you're not taught how to like trap bar deadlift a patient in PT school, or like impact loading, like they're literally putting in drop jumps and like snap downs and stuff, and you really don't see that in a lot of typical like PT settings or schooling settings. So maybe we can have a conversation about like how this may be a better approach to rehab and training.
Yeah, I mean, I would 100% agree, so if we just kind of, obviously it's kind of phase-like, which we know there's limits to that, because the human doesn't progress in this very sort of box-like neat fashion between phases, but just kind of looking at like taking a step back and looking at what they're doing. Okay, so like phase 1 here, they're familiarizing, right? So we're dealing with somebody who maybe low training age, something like that. early on, we're just really focused on making sure that they're safe with the movements, building a little bit of motor control. Maybe we're really not going for too much adaptations from like a tissue specific level. We might have some neural stuff going on if there's someone's like new to resistance training. And then we're gradually just kind of laying it in, strength endurance, things like that. I think this is an excellent way to think about rehab, because this isn't even like a post-operative situation, but I think if you kind of have an idea of kind of where your starting point is and where your ending point is, making sure that you're kind of touching on all these things, it seems like an excellent way to lay out a physical therapy plan of care. And I think, good PT, if we're talking about physical therapy versus training, I think they lie on the same spectrum. The starting points may be a little bit different. There may be a little bit more emphasis on, like a local envelope of function or maybe some tissue specific aspects in physical therapy, but they really shouldn't look all that different.
Yeah, when you have patients in general, do you kind of lay out a plan for them of like, okay, this is where I see us going in the next 2 to 3 months, and this is how I see us like loading these structures, these tissues, and providing some insight and rationale to why you're doing it. Because a lot of times I feel like in a lot of traditional ortho outpatient settings, you have this never ending like cycle of like body weight stuff with bands, with like, there's really no like end goal in sight, or there's no progress or tracking of progress. So how do you do that with patients? Just like, do you kind of create expectations from early on of like, okay, we're going to have to kind of make things harder each time you come in, or what's that look like?
Yeah, I think the first thing it probably starts with is a little bit of education and kind of understanding of, what this person may have going on, right? So let's take like this person in, for example, in this case study or example 3, like, so let's say like sarcopenia, low bone mineral mass, first thing is probably like, well, this is kind of, what is your understanding about, why you're here? Do you have any idea of kind of like what is going on? Like when you hear, osteoporosis, what does that mean to you? And they'll probably give you some answer that's likely in the ballpark somewhere. And I think there, once you have, you kind of have operational definitions or an understanding of what you think may be going on, then you can say, look, this is where I think we need to go with our rehabilitation or with our training programs. We kind of have these things are what we want to hit. I want to make you stronger. I want to develop some muscle mass that you're able to kind of get in and out of your chair, decrease your risk of falling. We also have to touch on, some of the osteoporotic changes that we have going on here for you. So the best way that we can do that is we can start to introduce some weight bearing stuff, yes, but also for an older population, we know that some low level plyometric stuff where you're kind of looking to produce force quickly is very important as well. So these are going to be elements in your rehabilitation that we're going to touch on. We're not going to jump into that on day one, but this is kind of the general course that we're going to follow. These are kind of the big rocks that we want to hit given your unique circumstance and your certain condition. And this is what that will kind of look like. So I think having an understanding of the condition or maybe the pathology that you're dealing with, kind of detailing that out to them to a certain degree, so that at least there's a common level of understanding. And then having a plan in your head as to how you're going to address things that you think are pertinent to that pathology, laying that out to them is important. I think more information is better, just from a buy-in perspective.
Do you ever think about, and I think it's different because you want to do, you're like sports PT, and so there is kind of an end goal in mind of return to sport. So you kind of assume that they're going to remain physically active and hopefully kind of create this change. But I'm curious with like outpatient ortho, of you kind of set these good things in action and in play, like in the rehab process. But then I'm curious, like how much of a drop off there is for most patients once they leave the rehab setting, because they really like, they may not have these things in place to want to continue that, because as we talked about earlier, they just might want to get out of pain. And if by the end they feel more confident and have a little bit less pain, then they may just like slowly regress towards back when they initially like came to you with less physical activity, more fear avoidance, all these things. I'm curious, like, if anyone in clinicals or PTs have had that experience with like outpatient ortho.
I've seen it. I mean, I've seen somebody, just for example, had an evaluation yesterday. Person was here 6 months ago for same patellofemoral pain. And they come back in yesterday, 4 p.m., same thing. Just stopped doing, whatever they were doing right there, just kind of deconditioned again further. Made the same mistakes that they did last time, too much, too soon. They weren't consistent with their resistance training right there. So I think it's very much kind of based on the individual. And, for someone whose day-to-day physical expression is maybe less intense, they can probably get away with it. For someone that is maybe trying to perform at a higher intensity or have a greater physical expression, maybe not. So as a provider, I think it's important that when you're kind of making discharge decisions, and understanding of, what is their terminal task that they want to get back to, and educating them to the fact that this is what it's taken to get you to here. I think it's important to understand that if you're going to continue to perform at this level or engage in these things, you should take it on yourself to kind of continue to implement some of these things. So I think it's important, as a clinician, to provide the education, and just an understanding of the terminal task, and make the discharge decision based on that. And if that person feels like, let's take a return to sport example for just for ease of conversation. If you feel like they're in a position where they don't have the self-efficacy to kind of continue to follow up on these things, maybe hold on to them a little bit longer too, right? Depending on the situation. But I think obviously you want to discharge someone with the ability to return to the task that they want to, but also maybe a better understanding of how to self-manage long-term.
Yeah, I think, at least in my experience, like just through teching and stuff, I feel like that's something that's missed a lot of the time. And I think it's something that we talk about a lot. Like, I think the PT profession likes to say that we want to promote self-efficacy a lot. But then when you see it in practice, there's a lot of times that you see that it goes missed, and it turns into the patient has to come to me to feel better. And once they feel better, like that's it, rather than continue anything in the long term.
I had a couple of people that I evaled that were came to the clinic before I was there, from sarcopenic, like balance issues, and kind of had a history of falls. And then I guess they went through the rehab process and were doing great. And then the clinic I have has a gym that they can have memberships to. They were going to the gym and doing really well. And then COVID hit, and then everything got locked down. And they just went from doing, I think they were training maybe 3 or 4 times a week, to doing nothing. And then their doctor wanted them to go back to PT. And so I evaled them for kind of just fall risk and other sarcopenic issues, because they went from doing all this activity to nothing and just regressed over lockdown. So I think that's huge to kind of keep that routine after rehab and continue that and figure out a way to stay active.
Kevin, with that telehealth model that they have now at Hopkins for the past few months, do you feel like the patients are more like they have more self-efficacy and they feel like they can actually do these things at home? Or do you feel like there's a lot of like, not complaining, but they don't feel like they're in control of their rehab because you're not with them?
I'd say it's very much kind of individual specific. So my kind of approach through the whole telehealth thing was, I took it much more as kind of like almost like an online coaching type thing, where I'm just kind of touching base with this person. How's your program? Like, I don't need to sit on my laptop and watch you do your fucking glute bridges in your house. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, so telehealth was great for me because it was like in and out in 15 minutes. Like, how you doing? Like, hit the note, just on to the next one. But I think it's very much dependent on the person. There were some who absolutely did phenomenal. They felt like, yeah, like this is it. But those are people that were probably going to do fine no matter whether the rehab was on telehealth or in person. I think it's the ones where they probably don't have as much inherent self-efficacy that struggled a little bit more with the telehealth stuff, or the ones that their idea of physical therapy is heat, stim, a little bit of banded work, massage, and then I'll see you on Wednesday or something like that. So those are the ones that I think had less of a positive experience with regard to telehealth. Does that answer your question? I don't know. I feel like I skirted around it a little bit.
No, you nailed it. It's pretty much like the people who are going to be successful will be successful no matter what setting. And then the people that may have some preconceived notions of what PT looks like just struggle with kind of taking it on themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's kind of, it's an interesting, I would classify it more as like a professional identity issue with physical therapy. I think that's something to where I'd like to see the profession move more towards, being paid for your time and your knowledge as opposed to what you're doing to people. I kind of view the profession much more as, we're performing a needs analysis with this person's, musculoskeletal issues, almost more like a consultant role. And ideally, that's the way that I'd like to see the profession kind of go. I think we're probably a long ways away from that, but that's kind of the approach that I've taken. So the low frequency model is something that I like, even when I was in clinic, like I've utilized that. So telehealth was kind of a smoother transition for me, I think, than some other clinicians.
I would like to see it like coming into the next few months now that COVID kind of forced a lot of PT's hands into kickstarting telehealth. I would like to see the way you may work with a patient in clinic that likely may not have done too well in telehealth because they didn't have that self-efficacy, but kind of getting the ball rolling in person and then transitioning into that and maybe seeing if that could produce better self-efficacy in that they can now, you kind of bridge them into like, okay, now you're doing it on your own at home. I'm just, like you said, talking to you for 15 minutes, kind of checking base, but maybe like empowering them in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a couple of that there. I think the challenging part with the telehealth was trying to do evaluations. So you get somebody, coming in, obviously it's going to be limited there because you're kind of estimating with regards to what they have going on. So I think it was challenging in that sense from an objective standpoint, but it was also a good in that, you were able to really try and hone in subjectively. And I think that's always a good skill to further develop, is kind of like the subjective portion of the examination. But I have actually had some success with that where, maybe the person kind of came back into the clinic now over the last couple of weeks. We were able to kind of, course correct, make a couple tweaks here and there, and then transitioning them back into like a telehealth platform. So kind of stay tuned on how that goes. But again, I think it's highly patient specific to me. I think the ones that excelled with telehealth would have probably done just as well in clinic, and the other ones maybe not. And I don't know if that's simply just more of like a personality trait type thing. I think it's hard to say.
Do you think it was almost, even though you weren't in clinic with them, and I don't know what the structure of like the clinics you were at with Hopkins was, but like, was it almost more personable because it was inherently like just you and that person, and it was probably like quieter, less distractions? Do you feel like you almost had more like attention between yourself and the patient?
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely some truth to that, I would say. The other thing I'll say is it kind of, what's interesting though is, so like, let's take an in-clinic visit, for example. Like I'm someone that is, I try to stay as removed from like my laptop or my computer as possible when the person's there. I kind of pay for that afterwards because then I'm backed up on patient notes and whatnot right there. So I think you can make it very personable in clinic too. It's just a matter of what kind of concessions you're willing to make with that. But I would say that there's some truth to that. It almost was more personable, especially from like a treatment standpoint. Because with an examination, it's in a private room. It's just kind of one-on-one with the person right there. You're not in that open gym environment. So yeah, in some ways I would say that it probably was a little bit more personable.
This semester, because everything was virtual, we had a geriatrics course that you're supposed to have like a geriatric community partner. And we ended up doing it just like a telehealth, like health and wellness, because we weren't able to have like a faculty member like be there. We didn't call her like a patient or anything, but we still got practice like doing documentation. I thought it was a good experience on telehealth more than it was like, it could have been my community partner, but then it was like a geriatric like patient encounter or whatever as far as learning experience. But definitely a lot of learning curves with the telehealth. Like we could barely do any objective, like we were 5 times sit to stand, 2-minute walk tests, like, but I think it was like you guys had mentioned, it was like a good insight into like what telehealth's like potential could be, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you can utilize it as more of like kind of like that check-in type, almost like an online coach type thing, I think that's where the real value lies with it. So naturally, you're going to kind of have a selection bias because people that gravitate towards that are likely going to do well anyways. But I think that's where I see the real value with it. Even more from like the medical side of stuff, I think like yearly wellness exams or something like that, I think is really valuable for telehealth, and hopefully that stuff's here to stay. But I don't know, from a PT perspective, I mean, I think, brick and mortar is still kind of where my preference lies, but there's definitely still some value in the telehealth side of it.
Okay, so we pretty much wrapped up the whole paper. Does anyone have any like final conversations or questions they had about it, just overall? Solid. Well, this was great. Thanks, Kevin, for running the party. Thanks for all the level up fam coming. If it wasn't for y'all, I'm pretty sure I'd have had like literally Gabe is the only UT Health student on here, so it's been a real intimate session between me, Kevin, and Gabe. So
All right, man. Thanks for having me. Hopefully it was worthwhile. I enjoyed it. I think it's a good paper. A lot of references too. So
yeah, it was a great paper. And
Thank
then
you, Kevin.
yeah, you got it.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome.
Yeah, next week we'll have Taylor on, wrapping it up, and then the next month, I don't know what we're gonna cover. But yeah, thank you all again. I recorded it. If anyone's uncomfortable with me recording it, let me know. It's just going to my school's drive so other students can watch it. It's not going out to like public anywhere besides that. But yeah, y'all enjoy the rest of your Saturday, and Thanksgiving, Kevin.
You got it, guys. Have a good one.
See ya.